Hi, everybody. So the first thing that I'm supposed to let you guys know is, number one, please silence your phones, and please remember to fill out the survey by the end of this. So once we get all this admin stuff out of the way, I just wanted to say, hi, my name is Kasita. Thank you so much for inviting me here today to the Adobe team and for making this whole experience so smooth. And yeah, it's just, I'm a little nervous and a little excited at the same time. So yeah, a quick introduction to myself. I've been working in this industry for the last 5 years. And during that 5 years, I've been working on some really amazing projects, the latest one being Captain America: Brave New World. And even though my experience in the industry isn't a very long time, my journey into 3D actually started back in 2012. And before I go into the demo that I wanted to show today, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got to where I am in the industry. So I'm from Indonesia, and I grew up in Singapore. And I don't actually have a professional arts background. My degree was in business marketing, and I took a very safe route, which was the norm for anyone growing up in a very traditional Asian household. But when I look back at my life and I kind of connected the dots, I felt like I was always kind of resonating towards not only the arts, but more so to art and technology. The first type of art that I was ever into, was actually pixel art. At 9 years old, I would be like hunched over a computer, zoomed up into a screen, pixel by pixel, trying to create some type of an imagery. I found a community of people online that I could share my art with, and that became something that I was more comfortable doing. I was more comfortable going online, sharing my art with strangers, rather than talking about it to my family and friends. And that's probably why it became such an easy transition for me to get into what eventually would bring me into 3D. Second Life. I don't know how many of you here have heard of Second Life, but back when I first joined Second Life, this was kind of a very new concept. It's a virtual world where you can make an avatar, drop into this virtual world, and pretty much explore and do anything that you want. It's very difficult for me to express what really hooked me into Second Life, because that means a lot of things to a lot of people. But what I wanted to do is show some of the creative items that I could see when I was in that world, and that would, I guess, illustrate this concept a little better. So what was really amazing about the assets that I saw in Second Life wasn't like, how high fidelity the graphics were or how skilled all the artists are. But what really was amazing is that people from all different sorts of backgrounds and cultures were coming together to create all these different assets. A lot of them range in professions, from housewives to even lawyers sometimes. And they were just kind of self-taught artists that really just wanted to express themselves and shape the world that they were living in. So for me, watching this happen in real time just felt like magic in a way. Every object was very personal, right? It doesn't feel like just game assets thrown into a scene. It felt like it was telling a story not only of what the object is, but also the creator behind it. And I think that was what really inspired me to want to learn how to do 3D so that I can kind of contribute into this world as well. And so one of the first projects that I ended up taking on was a recreation of an environment that really inspired me as a child. And I'm not sure if any of you here are Harry Potter fans by any chance, but the first project that I wanted to undertake was the Hogwarts Castle from the Harry Potter franchise. This was back in 2012. I spent about 2 months on it. And now looking back, I can see a lot of issues with it. I didn't know what UV mapping was. I didn't know what to do about normal faceting. All those technical details are not in the forefront of my mind. But when this asset was in-world and I could kind of walk around in it and kind of interact with it, that was when everything in my life changed. I was no longer just making 2D images. I was making a 3D item that I could not only interact with, but also see other people kind of explore and interact with it as well. So this castle is actually still in Second Life right now. If you wanted to explore it, you can totally do so. That would be awesome. So for the next few years, I spent a lot of my time outside of work just creating 3D assets in Second Life. I got to explore a very creative side of myself that I never could in real life. And even to this day, if anyone were to ask me, I mean, even at that point, if anyone were to ask me, are you a 3D artist? I would tell them, no, I'm a 3D hobbyist. I never saw myself as a 3D artist. This was just something that I did on the side. And nothing really, I guess, made it serious for me until one day I decided to take a class at Noman and wanted to improve my skills. This class at Noman was a creature sculpting class. And in that class, the professor asked me, so what studio would you like to work for when you're done with this? And I remember thinking, what studio would I like to work for? I never thought I could even think about that. You know, this was just a hobby for me. But with her encouragement and changing my mindset about, I guess, seeing the potential in what I can do, she really kind of gave me the push that I needed. And at that time, I started to put out feelers for different indie projects that I could participate in. And I ended up working on a couple really cool indie projects. One of them was called Highest Point. It was a mobile game where you are basically playing as a cave woman and you're throwing banana peels at incoming animals that's trying to attack your baby and your husband. It was a pretty fun project, and I got to do not only the concept art, but also the assets for the game itself. I was also finally approached by Linden Lab to form a team to create some of the starter avatars that you can begin with when you join Second Life. And so after having some of these freelancing gigs, it just felt more real to me that this could actually happen. And so if I I finally decided if I wasn't gonna do it now, I'm never gonna do it. So at 29, I quit my job and I enrolled in Noman full-time for the next 2 years. And you're gonna start to see some of the projects that I worked on at Noman. For the next 2 years, I got to learn under some of the best industry veterans that I've ever met. They taught me not only how to push myself in my 3D skills, but they also taught me the proper working pipeline. I learned so many different programs during my time there, from Houdini all the way to Maya, and of course, getting better at Substance Painter as well. From Noman, I landed my first job at Giant Step USA, and my first project was to do look development work for the digital avatars of the K-pop band aespa. And for a K-pop nerd, that was like the dream first project. After that, I made my way into films and episodics. So I had a stint at Tippett Studios where I worked on Secret Invasion, Spiderwick Chronicles, TED TV, and now I am currently at Digital Domain where I got my first movie credit this year in not only Captain America Brave New World, but also Creations of the Gods Demon Force. Thank you. And so it's not only been a really kind of crazy ride, but it's also kind of crazy standing here at GDC talking about my goals when a couple years ago that would never have been the case. So for today's presentation, layer by layer texturing with intent, I wanted to show you guys how I textured some of the material assets in this piece that I made specifically for this talk itself. I called her the Painted Champion, and I really wanted to create a character concept that represented how I felt coming into the industry. I was very excited, and I was like super ready to go. With texturing, it's very hard to find a stopping point. You can always kind of add more detail, you can always do more fidelity. But my goal for this project is, how do I get to 80% as quickly as possible so that I can sell a concept and an idea to a lot of people? And so today, the most important thing that I wanted to highlight is, rather than get overwhelmed by all the texturing and material work that you have to do, what can you do to, I guess, express the material that you're trying to portray? So for example, an armor. If I were to take a bunch of references and look at it, one of the things that I learned in Noman was approach something in 3D the same way that it's approached in real life. And what that means is, when you look at this reference, you have to kind of train your eye to look past all the dirt and the grime and imagine how this asset looks like when it's brand new. And that's going to be your baseline when you're texturing anything. So for example, when I look at this, really what sells this as an armor that was probably forged by a blacksmith, right? We see a lot of surface imperfections. We also see that there's a striation on the metal that goes in a specific direction. We see a little bit of pitting in some of the areas. And because this is probably forged with heat, metal kind of darkens around the areas that has been, exposed to heat. So let's now jump into Substance Painter. And I can show you guys how that's done. When we're in Substance 3D Painter, a material is essentially made up of various texture maps. If you press the C key in Substance Painter, you're going to be able to cycle through all your different texture maps. So like height, base color, roughness, metallic, normals. If you press Shift C, you can kind of go back. So when you start a material, one of the first things that you want to do is really just give yourself a base to work off of. Add a fill layer and just put in something, right? So for me, since I know I'm going to be working on steel, I decided to pick a light gray as the base color. For the height, I'm just going to set it at 0, so it's a baseline. And for roughness, you can dial it however you want, but imagine this as a sheet of metal that's brand new. And with the metallic map, it's always very straightforward. Is something a metal or is something not? So it's just 0 for no and 1 for yes. There's very little instances where this rule is being broken. In this case, it's a metal, so we're going to set it to 1. The next thing that I want to do is to tackle this a little bit more systematically. So the first thing is to kind of add that hammered look that the metal has. And, oh, by the way, this has all the high poly baked down to the low poly already. And the reason why I didn't want to do a lot of high poly sculpting is so that I can show you what you can achieve just on texturing alone. So in this case, if we wanted to add that hammered effect without the use of sculpting, we can do so by just adding a fill node and then using a noise texture. In my case, I use Cells 4, and I plug it just into height so that it only controls the height values. What we want to do now is to kind of break it up so that it's not so sharp, right? So I'm going to go to the height map. I added a blur node to it, and what that does is that it just breaks up all the forms and just makes it look a little bit more organic. And now I add a blur to it, and this just overall moves every shape around. And if we shift back to material, which is M, by the way, you can see that hammered effect. And you want to do this very subtly so we can put a levels node that only adjusts the height and adjust it back down. And since everything is procedural, you can go back to your cells, right? And then you can start to tile it a little bit differently if you want a different look to it. And that's what's really powerful about the whole Substance Painter workflow. So now I wanted to do the same effect on the edges of my armor. I'm going to add a fill layer, increase the height a little bit, and start to put a mask on it. So in order to view the mask, I'm just going to press Alt and click on this icon so that I can look at that. And one of the cool ways to isolate the mask is to use this thing called UV border distance. And UV border distance is going to allow you to kind of add seam lines around where your UV islands are. So UVs are important, guys. And then now what we want to do is do the same thing, add a little bit of organicness to it, blur it out. And when we look back at the material, what that does is add like that puckering look on all the edges. So now we want to tackle that striation that we see in the metal. And in order to do that, I added, one second. I added a noise node, and this time instead of plugging it into height, I plugged it into roughness. And the reason for this is because the striations that are formed on metal tends to happen when a human is touching it and shaping it in some way. And so I wanted to kind of push that across not only in the height information, but also in roughness as well. So with an anisotropic noise set at a tiling that pulls the direction in one area, I can now start to mask it out so that it only affects the area that I want. I create a mask, added a gradient, a linear gradient that is on triplanar, and just push it towards like the center. And then I would mask out the other parts, and then just repeat the same process throughout everything else. Not only, and I also feel like this is a little too, a little too high. So I added a levels node into my roughness and just lowered everything out. What you're trying to do here is to build the material up in a very subtle manner. You don't want to go crazy, and you just want to be able to kind of feel it a little bit. So once we have our striations, I decided to tackle the pitting that I see on the armor. And this time, what I did was create a fill layer. I know that in those little pitted holes is going to be a little bit of a darker color, so I just picked like a dark color, and I lowered the height information and I increased the roughness. And then now I start to generate the maps for it. So the mask that I ended up using for this pitting is a blue noise fast, and what that creates is like this really cool effect. You can actually use this for pores as well. That's really useful. I added a warp node again to kind of give it a little bit more organic detail. And then this is where you can start to use the generators to really isolate the maps to areas that you want it to be. When I look at the material, I find that with the generator, it just looks very, almost too perfect. So I like to always add like a grunge layer on top of that to kind of tone it down even more. And that's basically how I did the pitting. So for the decorative elements on the armor, this is where you can have fun, and it's a lot simpler than it looks. So essentially what I did here is that I used some of the amazing alphas that comes with Substance Painter, and I start putting it either on the trim, and I can also use a path tool to kind of add these alphas into the metal. So the path tool is going to be this pen icon up here. You're going to be able to look at the paths that you've made and still like make modifications to it. If you want to ever add to it, you can also kind of just paint the path wherever you want. And this is a new feature that I found incredibly useful in Substance Painter. So that's how I've done some of the decorative elements to this. Once we have all these, we have pretty much worked on the base height of this material. So now we can move on to color. With color, what I like to do with metal is to always kind of add a little bit of a hue change in the overall look of the metal. So what I like to do is create a texture like this that looks almost like an oil spill. I like to bring up the saturation significantly. I blur it out, and then I set this mode to overlay and really just dial it down. What that does is create that hue shift that you see in a lot of metals. And this is a very subtle effect, so I actually have it at 5, pretty much, which is right here. And now I want to address the darkening that I see on some of the references. So for the darkening itself, it's just basically the same thing that we've always done. We add a fill layer, this time only targeting color, and then I start to create all the different maps for it. So if I were to, if I were to press Alt and click on that, I can see all the different maps that I've created just to darken out the edges. So at this point, we've kind of gotten the overall look, right? And I noticed that I really wanted to punch out some of the trim details. So I added a highlight node where it's basically a lighter color set to overlay, and I put it into just the trims. And now that I have my base color and my base height, I start to evaluate my maps, and I look at roughness, and I go, this is a little too smooth. And so I wanted to do the same process, this time just in the roughness value itself. So my whole point here is to kind of show you that when you're building up a material, rather than putting smart material to your mesh and calling it a day, you want to be able to learn how to build it up yourself. That way, whenever you are adjusting smart materials in the future, you know exactly what it took to build up something. So once we have this metal looking completely brand new, this is when we want to start adding the age that happens on this armor. And the age maps and the damage maps are where you can start to really tell a story with this piece. With metals, one of the first things I like to do is add scratches to it. And for this particular character, I know that she is, kind of brand new to being a knight. And I didn't want it to be overly damaged or anything. So when I look at the map of my scratches, I really just isolated it to specific areas. And to do that is you just create a fill layer again, you make it a lower height, and I actually increase the roughness because when metals are being scratched, it tends to expose the material underneath it and makes it a little bit shinier. And the next thing that I added was a smudge. And the smudge is just going to be a roughness value that is shiny. And the way that I saw this was that she was probably dressed by either a squire or just, someone helping her out. And what I wanted to do was kind of put fingerprints on areas that would have been touched by a human hand, and then they would leave a little bit of an oily residue to it. And then we start to think about dust and dirt, which are very common aging effects. So with dust, what I like to do is I like to create a beige color that's a little bit noisy. I put it into the base color, and I increase the roughness value by a lot because it's dusty, right? And we know that with a metallic map, in this case, dust is not a metal at all, so I'm going to turn that to 0. And with the values in place, you're going to see that it really helps sell the idea of dust. When I started using generators to place it on, and I always add my own paint mask so that I can take a paintbrush, like Dirt 1, and push the flow down very, very low. And I can start to paint in, push the flow down very, very low. And then I can start to paint in the dust. And this is where you can start to really tell the story. Where would this metal kind of turn dusty? Because if she's brand new and it's been polished recently, it should kind of stay pretty, pretty new. But maybe there's some areas that haven't been cleaned or was missed out, and those are the things that you kind of want to paint in. And when you do that, you want to repeat the same process, this time for dirt. And with dirt, I'm going to hide the mask. For dirt, I create a same brown, noisy texture, and in Photoshop, created a high pass, put it into roughness, because unlike dust, dirt does have a little bit of information in the roughness channel. And once again, it's not a metal, so I set it to 0, and then I repeat the same process of using a generator and then painting out in my mask. So if she's been rolling around in the dirt quite a bit, you can basically paint on a lot more dirt. And what happens with setting the values right is that you can automatically kind of see the metal lose its sheen and take on the properties of the new material that you're painting on. And that's just something that I find very useful as a texture artist because you get that real-time feedback. And what happens is that everything that you're painting is also going to kind of come through, it's going to come through into your base color, your height maps, and your roughness maps. So this is essentially how I did metals. I'm just going to undo it so it looks a little better. And so this is essentially how I did metals. So now let's jump onto another material, which is cloth. I'm not going to show velvet today because that's a little bit more complicated, but if you're interested, feel free to ask. For cloth, For cloth, we're going to build it up pretty much the same way. So I'm not going to repeat all the same processes. I'm just going to highlight some of the more interesting ones. We start off with a fabric base, and I like to use fabric linen for that because it comes with all the values that I need, and you're able to kind of change the color as you see fit. I sometimes just add a node that also allows me to adjust the color overall. And for this case, I'm going to darken it so that you can see the examples a little bit better. And we're going to start to create that overall warble that we made for the armor, but in this case for cloth. And that comes in the form of wrinkles. So let's look at the height map real quick. If we start at a base value of 0.5, which is what I like to start with, you can use a generator called inflate shrink wrap to immediately add this wrinkling effect around the edges of your UV seams. This is a really fast way to create instant wrinkles. And it's a very subtle effect, but it's a very subtle effect, but it's going to read well depending on how you looked at this piece in your rendering software. When I want to add more wrinkles, I like to use the Creases Soft or the cloth fold brushes textures. So these two here, as well as Creases Soft, is really good for adding instant wrinkles like that. I tend to then blur that out a little bit just so it's very subtle change. And I continue to kind of layer this on quite a bit. So when we now look at that height map again, you can see a lot more complex detail on this. You can obviously sculpt this in, but if anyone's ever worked with marvelous designer clothing that's very complicated, you know sometimes it's really hard to bake details. So I prefer doing it a lot in texturing. The next thing that I like to do is just add seams onto it, and this is just the seams generator. You can kind of place it wherever you want. I add a lace texture on my opacity map to kind of have lace through the hemline of the skirt, and then I can start to add the age maps the same way that I did with the metals. When it comes to fabric, though, there are a couple of age maps that are a little bit different than metals. One of them is called the sun fade. And what that is just when a piece of clothing has been exposed to the sun for a very long time, it kind of desaturates in value and almost increases in value as well. So I like to pick a color that's a little bit lighter than my base color. I picked a really extreme one just so that we can see what this does. And then I made a mask for it. And using light, I'm able to kind of just control where the sun is hitting on this skirt. And so that's a really useful tool as well. And to break this up and make it look a little less even, I added like a dirt mask over it. And that's essentially the sun fade that you see on this fabric. And then I want to add a little bit of age to this because when clothing has been exposed to the elements for a while, some of the edges kind of turn this yellowish color. I don't want to do too much of it though, But I start off with a base color that's a little brown and yellow, and I just create the mask for it, the same way that I've done for everything else. I use UV border distance and then broke that up a little bit more with some of the generators. I warped it so that it's more organic, did a blur to it, and that's basically how I get that very subtle shift on the edges. And with dust and dirt, we've seen this with the metal, so I'm just going to skip through that. And yeah, and that's basically how we do cloth. And now let's move on to skin, which tends to be the more complicated texture to do. Okay. So when it comes to texturing skin, it's going to take you a very long time and you're going to spend a lot of hours on it. But since the goal of the project is how do I get to 80% as quickly as possible, I learned that the method that works the best for me is to just understand the basic theory of what makes skin kind of feel alive. How do you keep that subdermal quality that skin has, but not spend too long doing that? So one of the concepts that really helped me was James Gurney color and light face color zones. And understanding this concept and using it in a lot of my skin texturing has really helped bring my skin to life a little bit. Essentially, the whole thing is skin takes on a different hue based on what is sitting right underneath it. For example, where bone is closest to the surface of the skin, you kind of see a little bit of a yellow tone. When an area is a little bit more fatty and have a lot of like oxygenated blood flowing through it, you kind of see the skin take on a little bit of a red tone. And for blues, those tend to be where hair follicles are closer to the skin. And we also use blue a lot for shadowing. If you ever take a human photograph, put it into Photoshop, and you do an invert on it, you're gonna get this weird X-ray looking thing. If you set this blending mode to color and slide it all the way to 50%, it's going to desaturate the human skin quite a bit. So when you want to paint shadows in human skin, it's not good to use blacks or browns. Using blues is going to give you the same effect that you want without muddying up the skin. So the whole color zone theory ends up being something that I utilize for all my characters. And what I notice is, of course, every single character is going to have a little bit of a different color tone. And you want to always study your references to know what works. For me, I tend to like to use a little bit of a green when it comes to female faces. I think that because it's a complementary color, it accentuates the lips a little bit more and brings out all the reds and the pinks of the face. And for any darker skinned character, because dark skin tends to reflect light a lot differently and a lot more, it also takes on a very different kind of undertone to the skin. And this is what I've found worked very well. This particular pass, I like to call it the clown pass because that's what the sculpt ends up looking like. And in Substance Painter, in my whole skin buildup, I have a clown patch right underneath here, which is what you've just seen. And if I were to take it away, you can kind of see that the skin really kind of dulls down and almost feels like there's no life to it. And so having that as a base has always helped me with a lot of my texturing process. I just wanted to say that because of time, I'm not going to show you the entire demo of painting skin, but if you're interested, I'll be doing a demo on the 19th at the Adobe booth, so feel free to stop by. And so with the clown pass, right, whenever I paint out my colors like so, these are essentially just base color set to either red, yellow, or blue. And I want to bring down all of this so that all the colors kind of blend together a little bit better. I do that by creating a fill layer of white and then kind of using the cracks brush, one of these two crack brushes, setting it to a very low flow intensity, and start to paint out a mask that looks like this. And what this does is that it almost simulates the look of veins and that subdermal quality that skin has. And once I do this, I create an anchor point on this folder, and this anchor point is going to eventually plug into an overall skin texture. So if I were to hide this compass, you can kind of see that there is this overall look, I guess overall texture to the skin. And it's going to relate to how you paint it. So the more fine you paint this, the more fine the skin is going to look. And since we're never going to be able to paint out every single pore and wrinkle, at least not in the time that I have for this, using an asset like 3D Scan Store or Texture XYZ is going to help massively. So using that plugged into base color, height, roughness, and normal, I can use Substance Painter's wrap tool to really project those textures onto the mesh. And that really helps because now we have our height channels kind of set up, our roughness, and not metallic because it's not metals. And for base color, since I do want to paint a lot of this in, I set it to a very low opacity amount. And what this does is just create a little bit of the details that I can kind of start off with. I added a little bit onto the lips for any bump map or anything that I don't see in my projections. And that's when I start to essentially paint in the skin color. Painting in the skin color is just a process of creating a fill layer with the color that you want to use, making a mask for it, and just painting it in. There's no shortcut to this, it's just a lot of time spent on it. And after painting all the skin, what I did was I added a high pass node because I wanted her to look a little bit more like a Renaissance painting, and I found that when it's paler with like pinker cheeks, it kind of appears a little bit more that way. And now I want to tackle the roughness on the skin. And how I do that is, since we already have a baseline value, we can kind of just work from here, right? I like to create a 50% gray node, and then, you're not gonna see it because it's 50%, and then just basically paint it out in the areas that I feel my projection was maybe too rough. And once I do that, I just create two different, I create two other fill layers for just targeting roughness. One that's very rough, so it's set to 1, and one that's very glossy, so it's set to 0. And I essentially just paint it in. When you think about what makes the face a little bit rougher, they tend to be situated in areas where you see a lot of peach fuzz as well. And areas that are glossy are going to be mostly the T-zones and anywhere where you have, like saliva or like any moisture, essentially. And once we have all of that, we have our skin pass. And with skin, you're going to want to spend more time to finesse it and really make your details come to life. But for the sake of this presentation, this was how far that I brought the skin, and I hope that that was useful for all of you. So that is some of the examples of how I textured this piece, and yeah, it concludes the end of my demo today. So thank you so much for your time and for having me. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask.
Hi. Hello.
Are you there? Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if you had any tips on how to manage the transition between metallic and dielectric or like non-metallic materials in the roughness metallic workflow, since usually it just creates like a little bit of a weird like transition, like white artifact on it, and I struggle sometimes with
Right.
how to get that transition to feel natural and correct.
So the question, I have to repeat your question, sorry. So your question is, how do I tackle when roughness and metallic kind of coincide together?
It's more like
When it's a non-metal or a metal?
yeah, exactly. Like
Okay.
if, on the dirt, like going on the metal, and then there's just
Yeah.
like the transition from one to the other.
Sure. So when you paint on a mask, because we're painting it by hand, sometimes that artifact is going to happen. What usually happens is that you can add a levels node to it and really kind of crunch up your values, because all it takes is that it needs a sharper mask, and that's all that is. Sometimes at work, for example, we usually like to have the mask kind of show all the range of what we painted so that the look dev team can kind of dial it a little bit down. But if you're doing it for your personal project, just add a levels node to your mask itself, and then crank it a little bit sharper towards the middle.
Okay, and,
Yeah.
and the levels, should it target like all aspects of the material, or just like metallic?
It should target only the mask of what you're masking out. So let's say you're painting dirt onto metal, you want to put that levels node on your dirt mask.
Okay.
Yeah. I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. I was just wondering if it's like, would it be like the levels that you would crunch up? Would it be affecting like roughness as well as like?
So when you add a levels node, you can kind of hello.
Yeah.
When you add a levels node, you don't want to add it to your roughness or your height. What you want to do is add it to your mask itself.
Okay.
Yeah, so the mask is what's going to kind of control that transition. If you add it to your roughness, then you're just going to be dialing your roughness, and
Yeah.
that's not what you want. So put it in the mask.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right. Thank you so much.
no problem.
Hello, over here.
I can't see.
Hi. From the way that you talk, it's clear you have such a deep understanding of metal, of cloth, of skin, of how each of these materials behaves differently based off of time or age or heat. How do you study materials to get such a good sense of them? Like, what's your research process?
For the most part, it's about collecting a lot of references. If you look at my hard drive back home, I literally have a folder of like every single material out there that you can find, and just spending time analyzing it. One good thing that I've been told to do a little bit more is to just step outside and look at what you're planning to texture. So if you're texturing sand, go to the beach, yeah, things like that. Just spending a lot of time observing and just having the curiosity to learn about what you're texturing is going to help a really long way.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Penelope. I'm a little short for the mic. Oh, there. I'm on my tiptoes. I had two questions. Thank you. One of those was in part about what she just asked about, which was your process. Do you go into depth and like research how the materials you create are made, if they are something like armor, for instance?
So do I go into research on how the materials are made?
Yeah, like to what extreme
Yeah.
do you go to come up with that process?
Right.
Because I know you said you used a lot of references, so
So I personally think it's a project by project basis. Most of the time, if I find something very interesting, I naturally kind of read up a little bit more about it. When it comes to materials that I've done at work, sometimes you're actually told how it's supposed to look like. You get a scan of it, and you just basically have to what that item is, and you sometimes get like a whole page of brief of like how this item is made, and that just helps art direct you a little bit. So I hope that I hope that
Yeah.
answers the question.
And the second question I had is a little different. It's how do you balance the realism of your substance painting when you use like shaders, for example, in a project? Because I know a lot of 3D projects use a lot of like shaders for environment and other stuff that reflect on the model. So what's that balance for you?
I think that's usually, so the balance of how the environment is going to interact with your pictures.
Yeah.
I think when you get that, so for example, oh, it's not me. I'm sorry. I guess I'm not sorry, but yeah. So there are certain things like roughness, metal, and height that are essentially gray materials, right? So it's either white, black, that's what you're painting. Values don't matter in terms of where you put the character in any environment. That's always going to work everywhere. It's just about understanding if I paint something to be at 0.5% value, how does that interact with the light? And that's something that you will end up working very closely with your lighting team on. When it comes to base color, what you want to do is, if you don't have, I guess, like a color palette from your, I guess if you don't have a color palette that you're working off of, it's good to establish one earlier on. It could either be looking at the environment and seeing that, oh, okay, this probably works better if it had a more pastel tone to it. Then you can kind of establish your color to that. And yeah, so I hope it helps.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for informative demo. And I really learned about the UV border distance and inflated shrink wrap. Those are all game changer. Thank you. And the invisible wear and tear difference that are now visible, like sunburn on the clothes. Thank you for all the info. And I want to ask,
Thank you.
in terms of the substance suite selection workflow, do you work on designer in one texturing project? Do you work on designer material most, or in the painter?
For me, if I'm doing environment work, I tend to be in designer quite a bit. If I'm doing character, I tend to be in substance quite a lot.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. And what about sampler? Can you use your self-token images and transfer them with substance sampler and using your
Yes.
project?
Substance sampler is actually something that I've been trying to play around with a little bit. It's very useful in turning any of your photographs into actual working materials. So you can definitely use that.
Oh, and cooperative with oh, okay. So as long as it's your own picture, and that's fine.
Yeah, as long as
Okay.
it's your own picture, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Don't take a picture from Google.
Right. Thanks for
No problem.
answering.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
My name's Vlad. I mostly work on the tech side these days. I do some miniature painting as a hobby, as a way to kind of exercise the creative side of my time and keep that knowledge going. Very inspiring seeing how you approach these things. And one thing that kind of struck me is how you mentioned, getting it to the 80% mark. And one thing that I've seen is when you want to really take something far, getting it to the 80% mark takes about 20% of the time, and then the last 20% takes about 80% of the time.
Yeah.
So this was a big lesson for me on the hobby side, but I'm curious for like all the, junior artists out here who are breaking into the industry and trying to maybe figure out how to best utilize their time, whether they're creating a volume of work for portfolio reasons or anything else, or at work. Do you have any advice on how to get to that 80% and then call that good enough, rather than committing to the whole thing and kind of focusing on perfection instead?
Sure. Yeah. So just to repeat the question, it's how do you know that you're at 80% and not kind of fiddle with it a little bit more, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're, that's actually a really hard balance to have, especially when you're looking at your own work. You tend to be your worst critic. I find that that's why it's very useful to kind of share your work with either like peers or friends, and if you have an instructor, to share it with your instructor, because they would be able to more objectively tell you if your work is at that 80% level, you know, and then over time, as you do more and more projects, you're gonna know that, okay, this is at 80%. Like for me, it took a couple years, and even now looking at that piece, I'm like, oh, there's so many things I wanna do to it. But you know, like you gotta just let it go sometimes and tell yourself that enough is enough, essentially.
Do you give yourself any particular goals on a project where you kind of say, with this project, I want to achieve X, and that's sort of the thing I'm going to focus on?
Yeah, so usually what I like to do is whenever I work on a project, if it's a concept art, then my goal is, am I selling the concept enough? And I know that seems like a very like vague question to ask yourself, but you gotta trust your own artistic eye with some things where you look at an image and you're like, okay, like I can tell what this image is saying, you know, yeah, I think that's like the best thing that you can do, I think.
Nice, that's awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's it? Okay.
Hi, my name is Ling Chu, and I'm working on character modeling. Because I saw the artworks you showed us or realistic style, right? So I'm doing something with stylized characters. So how to balance the textures, because you know, if you use a realistic way, that's too much for it. So how do you balance it?
Yeah. So with stylized characters, what I find is sometimes if you understand how to do a realistic texture or understand the concepts behind it, it will really help your stylized characters come to life a little bit. So for example, if we just talk about skin, right? Understanding what I was showing about like the face color zones, you can apply that to your stylized characters, but maybe like not paint in all the pores, and maybe with your subdermal layer, you kind of want to go a little bit thicker with your lines and things like that. What that does is that even though your stylized sculpt looks stylized, putting on a material that feels real will always still look good. Like if you look at a lot of like Pixar films, they actually go very in depth in their texturing, and their texturing sometimes goes even more realistic than a realistic character. So you just want to bear that in mind, that if you train your eye to look at realism, you're always going to be able to artistically dial that down when you're doing stylized characters.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Hi, I just have a more simple question. How much does 2D painting inform your process for designing 3D characters and environments? When doing a more complex project, such as the character you showed us, will the design or even final render start in a 2D stage, or do you just go straight into your 3D modeling software?
I think for the most part, most artists would always start with a 2D concept and such. But like I mentioned before, I don't have an arts background, so I can only draw stick figures, really. So in order for me to really see my concept come to life, I tend to do a block out in ZBrush. And I do a very rough sketch where I'm focusing mostly on silhouette. And once I get that done, I can use my references to really detail out my character.
Cool, cool, cool.
Yeah, cool.
Hello, my name is
Hello.
Dylan. I just want to say I loved the presentation.
Thank
All the
you.
tips you talked about were amazing. But specifically, I had a question adding upon the stylized characters. I see that you do a lot of realism-focused characters, but I was still curious if you had worked on a stylized character or multiple in the past, how do you balance the use of procedural materials and like that hand painterly look that a lot of stylized characters have? Like, do you use multiple softwares? I know a lot of people use a mix between Substance and something like 3D Coat, Textura. So like, how would your process kind of go for that sort of thing?
Right. I have worked on a couple of stylized characters, not very recently though, but my first job was a stylized character, and the texturing was done in not only Photoshop, but also Substance Painter. I think when it comes to making something look more stylized or realistic, the software really doesn't matter. It's how you kind of approach them. I think, you know, like, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question though.
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name's Ethan. I just had a question about the face color zones. I was just wondering, how would you go about designing different colors for different character types? Like how you mentioned the girl would like be slightly more green to like help the feminine features. So I was just wondering, how would you go about designing different color zones?
So when I read about the whole face color zone theory, essentially there is like there is a theory behind it as to the colors that you can use. And whenever James Gurney said that you can use blues, he does mention that you can use greens as well. And in terms of how did I come to the point of, okay, greens work better for females? It's about looking at photographic references. You're gonna see that a lot of fair-skinned females, when you look at the undertone of their skin, there is that weird, okay, I wouldn't say weird, but like, there is that like slight green tinge around some of the areas. And then if you look at another ethnicity, that could be a totally different color. It could be a little bit close to purple or something like that. So it's just about having a bunch of references that you keep in your folders and look at it, study it, get to know faces a little bit more.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.